Hi, this is my presentation on the response of body system to exercise. So I'll start with respiratory dynamics. So here are the averages for factors during the multi-stage fitness test in which we participated in. This was basically a bleep test where the participants had to run from one side of the hall to the next. Each time there was increased difficulty as they had to run the same distance in a shorter amount of time. So clearly on the screen you can see that during activity the averages of heart rate was 121, the average breathing rate was 25, the blood pressure at diastolic, which is when the heart is relaxed, was 97. The skin temperature during activity was 36, and the blood pressure at systolic, which is when the heart is contracted, was 151, and the RPE average during activity was 10. Furthermore, here are the averages for factors during the Wingate aerobic test, which is when participants had to cycle for short periods of time, but for a long amount of time in total. So during the activity, the average heart rate was 133. The average breathing rate was around 22 to 23 breaths per minute. The blood pressure at diastolic was 68. The skin temperature during was 37, well around then, and the blood pressure at systolic was 137, and finally the RPE average during activity was 13, which is clearly higher than the multi-stage fitness test. I'll go into more detail about the results from these tests further on in my presentation. Similarly, feel free to pause and look at these graphs which do show the systolic and diastolic results for the multi-stage fitness, the temperature, the RPE and breathing rate. However, I will go into more detail on these individually further on, and similarly for the Wingate test. Ventilation, breathing rate and tidal volume are all linked to each other, and there is an equation which shows how they go together. This is ventilation equals breathing rate and tidal volume. Ventilation is the movement of a certain amount of gas which moves into and out of the lungs. Breathing rate is the number of breaths that a person will take per minute, and the normal breathing rate for an adult who is resting is around 12 to 20 breaths per minute. Finally, tidal volume is the volume of air which moves into and out of the lungs during each ventilation cycle. Tidal volume and breathing rate put together makes up ventilation, so if one of these are changed or affected, the overall ventilation is altered. Ventilation will change and alter during exercise because the body is sensitive to increasing carbon dioxide levels, and so will change in order to match this. Furthermore, ventilation will change due to increases in the intensity of activity, which causes the greater carbon dioxide levels in the blood. There are different breathing rates for different stages, such as at rest, pre-exercise, and during exercise. For resting before exercise, the typical breathing rate for an adult will be around 12 to 20 breaths per minute. This is because there is no great need for shallow, rapid breaths, which are seen through large amounts of activity, as the demand for oxygen pre-exercise isn't high, as the muscles are not in need of extra supply in oxygen to contract. In contrast, during exercise, the typical breathing rate will be around 40 to 50 breaths per minute, which is a great increase from resting. And this is because there is a higher demand for oxygen to be transported to the muscles during exercise, as there is more energy needed as ATP, which requires oxygen. We participated in tests which have been made with a multi-test fitness experiment, where the participants had to run for a certain amount of times which varied across the diameter of the hall. Each level, the run became more challenging as the smaller amount of time to run across as they had a smaller amount of time to run across the length. The reason this was also challenging is because of the demanding nature of the test, as there isn't enough time to rest and allow the phosphocreatine to resynthesize ATP enough so that the demand in energy is high, but the muscles began to fatigue. From the data received from the test, different factors which overall affect ventilation were discovered. For example, the data received shows that at rest, blood lactate, which is the ionic form of lactic acid that is produced by muscle cells, red blood cells, the brain, and other tissues during anaerobic expiration. This explains the low amount of it which is present in the blood at rest, because the cells in the muscles haven't needed to convert the muscles' aerobic energy into anaerobic energy when the lactic acid is released. However, there is an increase in the amount of blood lactate during the activity. This obviously is due to the higher demand in energy which is required as the body begins to convert its aerobic respiration, which usually occurs in the mitochondria inside the cells, which convert aerobic respiration into ATP energy. But when there's a lack of oxygen due to the increase in the exercise and demand of oxygen, it converts the anaerobic respiration, so the blood it converts to anaerobic respiration, and so the blood lactate begins to increase. Shown on the graph, there is the highest percentage of blood lactate post-exercise. This can be explained by the fact that straight after exercise, the blood lactate will be at highest because it's reached its maximum secretion of lactic acid for that part of exercise. For the level of rest, each time getting increasingly more difficult, the reading of the blood lactate increases, and to get rid of the lactic acid, the person will have to breathe faster and the heart rate will increase in order to pump it away as a waste product. As the test proceeded, the demand for oxygen became higher and more important. One way the body can attempt to supply the muscles with enough oxygen is by increasing the breathing rate and to convert to more shallow and rapid breaths in the attempt to supply the body with it. This is why on the graph there is visibly a gradual increase in the breathing rate, because as the exercise gets harder, the more energy is needed which is produced from oxygen. For example, at rest a person will breathe normally with long and deep spaced out breaths because there's no demand for the muscles to have more energy to get ATP. However, this explains that at rest the breathing rate was 16 breaths per minute. However, in the middle of the test, when the participants were tested, the breathing rate was 24, which shows that the exercise causes an increase in the demand of oxygen. The next trial which was performed was the Wingate anaerobic test, which is where the participants had to cycle for 20 seconds as fast as they can, intervals. The results for this also show the physical demand on the body for the respiratory system. However, my results showed that the multi-stage fitness test was more demanding. This is because it went over for a longer time. During respiration, some air is reserved in the lungs, and no matter how much you inspire, an inspiratory reserve volume is the additional amount of air which can be inhaled after a normal inspiration, which is the tidal volume. The inspiratory reserve volume is between 2,000 and 3,000 milliliters in the human beings. You can see this here on this graph, the different stages of respiratory system. However, the expiratory reserve volume is the amount of extra air which is exhaled during a forceful breathe out. The average expiration reserve volume is about 1,100 milliliters in males and around 800 milliliters in females. Another lung volume is its vital capacity. This is the maximum amount of air that a person is able to breathe out from the lungs after a maximal inhalation. it is equal to the whole of the inspiratory reserve volume, tidal volume, and expiratory reserve volume. A spirometer can be used to measure a person's vital capacity as they blow on a tube. The maximal amount of air that they can get out of their lungs is shown on the tube. This can be used in medical uses as well, such as asthma, which also affects the amount of breathing, the breathing rate and inspiratory reserve the person has. As seen in the diagram, there's also residual volume overcapacity at the bottom. It's the volume of air present in the lungs at the end of passive expiration, which can happen at any time and during exercise. The total lung volume is around 6,000 millilitres, which is about 6 litres. It's the maximum amount of air that can fill the lungs as a whole. MVPA stands for Mechanism, Volume, Pressure and Airflow, which happens during exercise and in everyday life. During exercise, this just happens in a more dramatic, contractual and fast way, but it does happen in everyday life in the normal breathing. There is inhalation and exhalation always. Inhalation involves the intercostal muscles surrounding the ribs contracting, and this causes the ribs to be pulled upwards and then outwards, which increases the volume of the lung area and capacity. And due to this increase in volume, the pressure of air inside decreases. The diaphragm contracts and therefore lays flat, which reduces pressure and increases volume. This causes the external pressure of the environment air pressure to be higher and causes air to rush into the lungs. For example, the muscles relax and therefore the ribs move inwards and down. The diaphragm therefore relaxes and folds up into the middle slightly, and these things cause the volume of area to decrease and therefore the pressure increases. The air pressure inside the lungs is now higher than the external pressure, and so the air is forced out. Inhalation is triggered after exhalation has happened, where all the air apart from the inspiratory reserve volume has been squeezed out of the lung area, and there is now a demand for oxygen. And so the body will switch and change certain factors, such as the diaphragm position, in order to allow air into the system by increasing the volume. Exhalation is triggered when the most amount of air possible has been collected and is let out. The Walser manoeuvre is performed by giving off quite a forceful exhalation against a closed airway. You can usually do this by closing your mouth and pinching your nose, as seen in the diagram, whilst expelling air out as if you're blowing up a balloon. This manoeuvre can be used to help balance the air pressure in your ears, such as on an aeroplane people might do this, but also causes several rapid changes in your heart rate and blood pressure. The Herring-Broer inflation reflex is a reflex which is triggered in order to prevent the overinflation of the lung, which is very important in not only just respiratory levels but stretch receptors present in the wall of the bronchi and the bronchioles of the airways as they respond to excess stretching of the lung during large inspirations, preventing the overstretch which may not allow to return to usual. The expiratory control system is the main function to send signals to the muscles that control respiration to cause breathing to occur. The main respiratory control centers are typically found in the pons and the medulla of the brain. Which generate the basic pattern of inspiratory activity. As seen before, here are my graphs for breathing rate, however, I'll just go into a bit more detail now. So, as we can see from both tests, it's clear that from rest, this is quite a low level of breathing rate, as explained that the muscles don't have a larger demand for oxygen, which would be supplied by a faster breathing rate. So this is quite a low level. Seen for the multi-stage fitness, as each test goes on, there is a steady increase in breathing rate, which shows that as the muscles begin to fatigue and the ATP levels lower, there's a demand for more oxygen, which